Okay, so Jim, when it comes to visualization, I actually have a very specific memory of when I first learned that there was even a mental side to sport and that visualization was a thing. And my college coach, Mark Coogan, was an Olympian in Atlanta in the marathon. And I actually saw him when I was 6 years old run in his Olympic race, not knowing he would become my coach. And then years later, he was my coach at Dartmouth. And I remember I was just coming over the curve of athletic. I guess it was like I was just coming into my own as an athlete physically, where I felt like I could finally carry the weight of the training, the pressure maybe of being on a college team. And then I remember he came in when I was a junior and he was like, there's a mental side to sports. And we were like, what do you mean? And he's like, don't you guys visualize? And we had no idea what that meant or what it was. And he was like, oh, there's a whole other half to this that you have no idea, but you're about to learn. So I remember that moment. And I mean, I want to tell you what he told us, but I first wanted to ask you what that word means to you.
Yeah. Well, first, that's a pretty cool story. And I think a lot of athletes I work with have that moment of realization where, you know, when we're younger, when athletes are younger, they're training and it's the physical side that's emphasized, you know, and coming to that realization of there's a whole other dimension to this game, which is the mental side, is a really cool realization. So, and visualization is one of the mental sides of the game, so to speak, that has just so much evidence behind it, so much empirical support, and that a lot of the best athletes are using. So visualization to me is fundamentally about a simulation, you know, using our imagination. And like any of us can use our imagination, right? So that's intuitive. We can do this. Visualization to me also actually means more than just the visual, right? Because that's actually probably a common misconception. The term visualization is the most popular one to describe this skill, but visualization to me means a really vivid simulation in our minds using all of the senses that we possibly can to simulate a sport experience, to simulate a physical skill. It could be to simulate anything really, a scenario. It could just be standing on the starting line, and that's a pretty vivid way to visualize. So to me, it's a way of simulating in our mind, training, if you will, without actually physically training or physically moving our bodies. That's kind of what it means to me.
Yeah, that sounds like what I was taught too. And I remember the first example that I was given was, you know, classic in cross country, in the sport of cross country, are hills, our enemies, right? There are lots of hills.
They pay the bills.
Yes, that's right.
But still very much an enemy.
Well, that's in training. Hills pay the bills in training, but in the race, it's like the thing you most fear, I think. For sure. And I remember my coach saying, you can visualize yourself going over the hill without going over it before you go over it. And then when you get to the hill, it'll be like you already did the commitment and you did the work in your mind. And it takes away, you know, a huge percentage of the perceived effort during the race. It can
reduce the perceived exertion. Yeah. And that's one of the, I think, gifts that people get when they visualize routinely is when the performance moment actually comes, they get this great sense of familiarity. Like I've been here before. I've done this right multiple times in my mind. So when that moment actually comes, we're better prepared. We're more confident. And, you know, when we're visualizing vividly, our brain is acting in a similar way as it would when we're actually performing the skill, right? When you're visualizing and imagining running over the hill, the parts of your brain that activate your legs to move and carry you over the hill, those are to an extent activated. So there's really like a physical training component to it as well as the mental.
Kind of like how like a dream can feel like you really went through something.
Yes, I use the dream example a lot.
Oh, you do?
I do. Like when I talk about what visualization can do and why it's so powerful and what it should feel like, I talk about how when you're dreaming, let's say it's a vivid dream, or let's say it's even a bad dream, you know, it's a nightmare, and you wake up from a nightmare, which we've all done. Like, what does that feel like? What is your body doing, right? Number one, it feels incredibly real. Like whatever you were dreaming actually happened. And there's this physiological, this autonomic nervous system response, right? Where you're sweating, you're breathing faster, your heart rate is increased, and you did nothing, right? Your body was stationary. In fact, your body is paralyzed during REM sleep, and yet there's this massive physiological and psychological response. That's kind of the power of visualization, is what it can do is conjure up all those emotions, all those feelings. That's one of the ways in which it's such a powerful tool.
Right. And just like a dream, you don't actually need the dance partner, and you don't need the real hell. You don't need the real whatever chaotic things that happen in our dreams.
Yes.
You don't need that dance partner to make the effect of the visualization feel real and actually have an effect on your, I guess, adaptation, maybe.
That's right. And what you're talking about is one of the reasons why visualization is so powerful in sport rehab. We were talking earlier about your injury rehab. It's, I do a lot of work with this with athletes during their rehab and return to sport process. There's only so much load they should be putting on their bodies, right? And this is true for a non-injured athlete as well. Like, there's only so much load you can put on your body. There's only so much physical training you can do, right? Athletes aren't at the highest level, aren't typically separating themselves from other athletes by doing way more volume. Or if they are, it's going to catch up to them eventually, probably, right? A way they can separate themselves without taxing their body any further is by getting mental reps in, right? Mental practice. For a healthy athlete, training, it's an advantage. And for an athlete who's coming back from an injury, also an advantage, right? And so that visualization might look like doing reps of your rehab exercises after you've done them physically, then doing them mentally. And a lot of research shows this, which is a combination of physical therapy and motor imagery. A certain type of visualization tends to be more effective than just the kind of standard care physical therapy alone. So it's totally a way of getting in more practice and training while preserving your body.
That so many things come to mind for me with that one. I remember reading The Inner Game of Tennis.
My favorite book.
Is it really?
My favorite sports psychology book, by the way.
It's so great.
It's like the Bible.
Yeah. So this book, as you know, is basically, it's so many things, a little antiquated in parts, which is why we're here updating all of the information.
Exactly.
Okay. But the real thing of like, you can't, or the best way to learn a sport or to learn movement isn't in these siloed parts, but is in kind of watching and imitating. Yeah. And I suppose there must be an element of the connective tissue between you watch someone swing a tennis racket and you basically are like, you're like visualizing yourself as them, maybe is the first step, right?
Yeah.
And it's such a cool, it's so applicable to not even super technical sports, because even in running, I remember I used to train with all these guys and I would run behind them and I would just like kind of pretend to fall into their stride. Yeah. And that, I think, there's this imitative effect, or you pretend you're a gazelle or whatever it is, right? Yeah. Which we could get into all the like fun visualizations you can have. But truly, I thought about that when you said with the rehab, because rehab is so often so technical and specific and it's not cohesive. Maybe what visualization can do is bring some of the like cohesive glue between in movement and the patterning.
Yes.
Right?
It's making those motor patterns more efficient. And we know that from the research, that when you're doing this kind of motor kinesthetic imagery where you're feeling, you're seeing yourself do the movements, but you're feeling as well. Like I said, there's a lot happening in the brain there. Similar motor areas of your brain are activating. And what happens is at the neuromuscular level, there's boosts happening, that connection is becoming more efficient. Moving the body is about the peripheral, limbs and tissues of the body, but it's also about the brain as the central command center, right? Becoming more efficient and effective at moving the body. And that really is where the visualization side comes in, is really effective. And just to piggyback on what you were saying about the kind of observing an action and also visualizing, I was just talking with some people about this, that over the past decade or so, there's a lot of research now looking at action observation plus visualization, which makes good sense, like combining the two. As you were saying, you're looking at someone running at their stride. You're also kind of mimicking maybe their tempo, their cadence. You're seeing how they carry their arms. You're seeing their foot strike or whatever it is, right? If you're seeing that and then you're visualizing it shortly thereafter, you've primed your mind on what that visualization is. And then when next time you execute, the skill you run, your visualization is then priming that movement. So there's like this synergistic effect. And it does seem, based on some research now, that combining those two, observing and visualizing, is potentially more effective than either alone.
That makes sense. And aren't you kind of brilliantly removing the largest barrier of all, which is like your physical body?
Yeah.
Because when I think about, wanting to do something that I've never done before, or like even imitating these great athletes that I want to be like, there's something about being able to imagine it where I remove the weight of gravity on my body, and maybe the reality that I may not be able to actually do it like I could imagine it, but by removing it, I can suspend disbelief.
Yes.
And maybe leap over a barrier of doubt that is bound in maybe our natural inclination to feel gravity over feeling capable or something, especially when it comes to the physical world.
Yeah, you're right. There's something about, right, in our minds, it can sort of be a playground. We can do anything that we want to do. And if there's some physical constraint that's holding us back, we can imagine what it would be like unconstrained, I'm thinking about like, in running, there's kind of like overspeed training, depending on what kind of athlete you are, what distances that you're running, like ways of running faster. I don't know, there's probably a correlate there for visualization. Like you can imagine where you want to be. It might not be exactly where you are now. And through repetitions, you're kind of programming your brain to say, hey, do this. And as long as it's somewhere in the stratosphere of possibility, like your brain is kind of directing your body to follow suit.
Yeah, it's shooting for the moon and landing among the stars. And if it's a matter of getting over a big hill, then if you land among the stars, getting over a huge hill, that's actually like getting to the moon in a way.
Totally. No, that's a big one. Yeah.
That's really cool. Well, so then in this case, what is visualization not? Like, what is it? What is it not?
That's a super important question, honestly, because tons of people are aware of visualization. And a lot of athletes I start to work with kind of say they're doing visualization, but there's just a lot of misconceptions. And there's so much science out there on best practices for visualization, but that's not often translated to the public. So part of that is, what is visualization not? One thing that comes to mind is it's not just about visualizing like I won the gold medal, I'm on the podium, right? Those are outcomes, that can be a potentially powerful form of visualization in itself because there's a motivational component to that, right? If you're someone who's having difficulty believing that could be you, that can be valuable. But I think about it the way I think about kind of mental performance in general, which is shifting from the outcome focus to the process focus of, okay, if what I want to do is be on the podium, win a gold medal, win a race, how am I going to get there? What do I need to work on in my workouts? What kind of technical cues do I need to pay more attention to? What kind of focus do I need to have on my runs? And that can be the focus of your visualization, right? So I would say that's one misconception, that it's focused on outcomes. It should be more focused on process. Another misconception, I kind of alluded to this earlier, is that it's just visual. All the research that shows the power of visualization on performance shows that it's a multi-sensory experience. You should be recruiting as many senses as you possibly can that are relevant to the experience. To start off, you should be vividly setting a scene. And I think sometimes I'll explain this to athletes in a way you might appreciate, like you're a screenplay writer. Like you're writing the screenplay of this moment in your sport. So what's the scene? What time of day is it? What's the start and end point of the scene? Like imagine the things all around you in your environment. And you could, I could ask you to do this now for like the start of a race. It could be USA's, it could be the Olympics. And just by inserting all of those sensory details, you could probably start to feel something in your body, as if you're actually there. So the scene setting is incredibly important. Not everyone does that. The kinesthetic component, the body feeling component, is also incredibly important. Like I said, it's not just visual. For most athletes, the most important thing is the body. So if you're not feeling yourself do these movements and execute these skills, then you're missing out on a big component of it. Another thing is visualization. The way it's typically studied is it's scripted. Like I said, the screenplay. So what I'll do with athletes is we'll sit down and we'll write a script together, which is like first person, do all the things, write down all the things that you're going to be doing that you want to do. and include the details of like, here's what I'm thinking about, here's what I'm feeling, here's what I'm noticing in my body. That all makes it more vivid. Another thing I'll say is that it needs to be consistent. You know, the visualization practice needs to be consistent. It needs to be updated as you train. As your training progresses, so too should your visualization practice progress. Those are a few things.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it seems like doing the visualization at a high level, meaning doing it, I don't know if the word would be accurately, or like when you're saying like
I'd say high fidelity is sometimes the word I use, like a high fidelity simulation.
Yes. Yeah. And it seems like doing that is really the key, because it seems like doing a low quality visualization, to give it another word, is almost like a waste of time. And the only reason I bring it up is because I've also seen a lot of athletes be in their sport, in their mind 24 hours a day, and it's exhausting.
Yes.
And so some athletes seem to have trouble actually hanging up the shoes and going and having lunch with their friends or whatever it is, falling asleep. And totally. I imagine part of it is that they're either visualizing the wrong things or they're not really visualizing with this definition, you know?
Totally. I think what happens a lot is, you know, as an athlete, I'm sure you can think of times where you were just thinking about a race, an upcoming event, you know. I think anyone knows this experience, right? You're just thinking about it. It's playing through your mind. You're visualizing, but you're not visualizing in a structured and productive way. It almost becomes like a worry. So in a sense, what I'll sometimes tell athletes is visualization is a way to take that worry, right? You're probably thinking about the event anyway. So let's be deliberate and structured and actually mentally rehearse what you want to happen, right? Because what can happen before a competition? You know, what if this happens? What if that happens? We start thinking about the potential bad outcomes. Okay, if those things could happen, let's actually mentally rehearse those things. If they're realistically possible things that could go wrong, insert that into your visualization. And that's actually another misconception about visualization, is that it needs to be kind of squeaky clean, perfect performance. You know, but that's also exactly.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Before the Olympics, I ran my first European championship, and those girls are way more aggressive than the Americans. And I learned the really hard way that you can fall down in not a steeplechase. It was a 10K. And I got like knocked down hard and was like finished the race covered in blood. And I'm Greek American, and the Greeks were very sweet. And they're like, that's how we know you're a Greek, because you never give up. But they're like, but then it was like, do not let that happen in the Olympics. And I remember being really grateful actually that I did fall, because then I was like, all right, if this is possible, this bad outcome, then it's very likely that these same girls are all going to be they're all going to be in my race again, right? Yeah. And they're all going to be just as aggressive and rude. And I need to figure out how to like assert space. And also, if somebody goes down, what am I going to do? Because I'm not going down in Rio. And I remember I did that same type of visualization. I mean, it's embarrassing, because I was like, my visualization was basically, girl trips in front of me, I get my feet up like I'm in a basketball game, not a track race and soccer game, and I do whatever it takes to not fall down. And and then sure enough, it happened in Rio, and I did not go down. And I think it really helped to visualize the possibilities there. But it was difficult, because if I didn't know that it was possible, I don't know that I would have even thought it was possible. So sometimes it's a little scary to be like, what if you don't know what bad to visualize?
Right. No, it's true. And that's why I try to constrain people. Like, let's think about the most realistic things that could go wrong, right? Because our anxiety can run rampant. We can think of all kinds of kind of wacky things, right? So things that have happened in the past, that's a pretty good thing to populate into your visualization of, okay, it happened once, it could happen again. And it's so cool to hear that you did that, because a lot of people are hesitant to do that, right? It's this idea of like, I'm going to be manifesting this into existence by visualizing it. You know, our brains don't have those kinds of magical powers typically. Like, you know, what you're doing is I would call it kind of a tactical form of visualization. Like you're imagining different scenarios that could happen and how you want to respond. And what often happens when athletes are doing this is, in the moment of the performance, their reaction time, right, might be a little bit better.
Yes.
Because their brain and their nervous system, they've kind of practiced it already.
Yeah, you're like ahead of it is like being in a school play, because like I also was in school plays growing up, and I remember like you visualize like, because you see the I'm just imagining all these kids backstage, but you're basically like watching the play happen that you guys have rehearsed forever and ever and ever. And so you do know the next step. And so when the tap dance starts kicking in, you're like, and I'm about to go and dance out there. So I feel like it's not so dissimilar. Yeah. You're just a kid in a school play at all times.
I like that. That's all it is.
Yeah. And I mean, it really seems to, like, in a broad sense. And then I really want to ask you about the science of it, because I don't know anything about the science of it. It seems like it helps you separate and account for what you can control, what you can influence, and what you can't control.
Yeah.
So you're really trying to actually, it seems like there's visualization probably for each of those categories. And then maybe it leaves space for the really unexpected stuff, because we do need some willpower. Yeah. Because some things we just can't predict. Yes. But it seems like this is leaving space for that. Yeah,
it's true. I think when I'm advising people on how to visualize, I want them to build in sometimes like stressors, which again is a simulation of the real world, because in the real world, there are stressors, there are random things that happen. There's randomness and chaos in the world, right? And one kind of easy example of that might be visualizing and integrating the sound of like crowd noise, which is a kind of a chaotic, random thing. You can't predict what it's going to be like. A golfer, ideally is playing under complete silence when they're about to take their swing. But what if some random person yells something out? That's within the realm of possibilities, right? And you can't control it. And in the real world, you can't also simulate that. Like you can't, tell someone, hey, make noise, because you know it's coming. Right. You can create that kind of scenario in your mind, of executing the skill. And then sort of the advanced levels are like executing the skill with these increased levels of difficulty, these increased levels of, things that could happen. So I think it's true. We're never going to be able to have complete certainty in sport. And that's why we're playing the sport. Exactly. Kind of, right? It wouldn't even be a sport. Like, what would that be? Yeah. What is it? Well, that's why we're like, well, sorry. My friend recently was like, well, no one's going to replace athletes. Like we still, and that's I've thought about this. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's not scripted. You can't predict what's going to happen. Yeah. It's unfolding in a somewhat chaotic manner, and there's beauty in that. So, it's easy for any of us, athletes or otherwise, to want to latch on and control everything. And visualization is a tool to prepare your mind and body, but, it's not a tool for controlling everything, and that's something that we need to learn over time and with experience. Well, tell me, I'll flip this now, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So Jim, tell me about the science of visualization. Like what's actually happening in my body when a day or two before the race, that's usually when I do it, is like not right before, but I give it, a day or two before. Yeah. What's happening in my body and in my mind when I'm doing this? Yeah. So there's a lot happening, really. It's a very active process, visualizing. It's interesting to partially answer that question. This has been a question that researchers have had for a very long time, almost 100 years. And I was recently coming across a study from, I think, 1930, where this researcher ran people through an experiment and had them visualizing lifting a 10-pound weight with their right arm, their bicep. When a control group didn't, they didn't visualize anything. And what happened is he had this kind of sort of electrical current measure of muscle activity. We have EMG nowadays, which is more advanced. This was kind of a crude measure. But what he found was in 93% of these experimental trials, there was a 450% increase in electrical activity of the bicep compared to its relaxed state, which is pretty interesting. That's not the level of activity in a muscle that's actually moving, but nonetheless, it means that there's something happening even in like the peripheral muscles when we're visualizing a movement and when we're visualizing with that kinesthetic component, right? Trying to feel. So that's one thing. Like I was saying with this sort of dreaming, right? When we're dreaming and it's vivid and it's emotional, our nervous system is involved, right? We're having these kind of involuntary increases in heart rate, respiratory rate, sweating potentially. So if you're visualizing, again, like the starting line of the 10K at a major race, and you're really doing it in a vivid way, you might notice those physiological changes.
Wow.
And like, I love that kind of visualization, just like visualize the start. It's not like physically complex, but it's so emotionally evocative, and otherwise things happening in the brain. We know from, systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have looked at a bunch of fMRI studies that capture what's happening when people visualize, is there is a substantial amount of overlap in neural activation between observing a movement, imagining a movement vividly, and actually executing it. So one way I often talk about visualization is you're sort of tricking your brain. You're tricking your brain into thinking that it's actually performing the skill. So, the premotor cortex, which is involved in movement planning, that's activated. Even deeper brain structures like the cerebellum, which is involved in coordinating movement and balance and movement timing, that's activated when we're visualizing vividly a movement. And other kind of motor areas of the brain and the parietal cortex, those are all activated. Again, not to the full extent as if we were moving, but it's a pretty good simulation of it. So like I've said, it's kind of like training without training. And the best thing to do that we know from the research is to combine all of these things. Of course, I would never recommend visualize instead of training, right? But what I would recommend based on the research is a mix of physical training and mental training through visualization. And like I said, observing, if you can, and doing all those three things together, you're getting a lot more than someone who just physically trains.
Right. And the observing is the part where you can kind of expand what you know to be possible in movement at all, right? Because you're like watching people do the extraordinary, and then you can make it your own.
Bit. You're like, wow, what would it be like? What would it feel like for me to do that?
Yeah.
If it's a pace that, seems really, potentially just out of reach, like what would that cadence feel like in my legs, and what would my body feel like doing that? And what exactly is that timing like? That's another thing we know from the research, is that when we're visualizing, it's ideal to visualize that skill in real time, as close to real time as possible, as if we're actually executing it. So that is clear running applications, right? If you're visualizing a segment of your race, like think about like what cadence and tempo am I actually running at? What's my pace? And you can even watch a video of yourself, right, at the exact pace that you want to be achieving. And then you can visualize it. You're just programming your brain and nervous system to later on execute that.
That's really cool. Tell me what athletes can expect to feel as the outcome of this practice.
Yeah. So there's some good research on this of kind of when you can expect the benefits of visualization to show up in your performance. So there's a couple studies I can reference. They're meta-analyses. So they're studies of studies, basically. And there was one that just came out in 2025. They reviewed over 80 studies, I think 88 studies on visualization, particularly that kind of motor imagery, kinesthetic kind of visualization in sport. And they looked at all the studies where the visualization protocol had a positive outcome, when there was, a strong effect. And they evaluated what did these protocols look like? How long did people visualize? How often? And what they found was basically, it's nothing too dramatic in terms of time, right? It was 3 times a week for about 10 minutes per visualization session and over 100 days, which sounds long, but it's 3 months or so. That's the time that they found to see really significant pronounced effects in your sport in terms of, actual motor skill execution, tennis, soccer. They looked at all kinds of sports, really. But from what I find, and from what my athletes find who I work with, is you don't have to wait typically 3 months to see any kind of benefit. You're going to start seeing benefits sooner if you're visualizing the right way. You're going to start to prime your attention and your focus, all right? If you're visualizing something with a particular technical cue in mind, you're going to find that in your actual training, you're focusing on that cue more, right? Again, the physiology of what's happening with visualization is you're priming those neuromuscular connections. You're literally helping your brain recruit more muscle fibers in some cases. So you might see and feel that movements are coming a little bit more easy and a little bit more efficiently. You might feel, on the psychological side, more confident, more motivated. We talked about that sense of familiarity, right? Those kinds of things can start to come maybe in a few weeks, but to really see measurable, pronounced effects, it might take a few months. And to be fair, that's true with physical training too, right? With physical training, it's not going to happen overnight. And the same is true with mental training, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's cool. Wow. So the studies are showing that it really is working.
Yeah.
And for athletes across all expertise levels?
Yeah. So there's been studies on that, looking at visualization for even youth and adolescent athletes through the lens of motor skill acquisition. That's one way that visualization is so powerful, is I'm learning a skill, right? I'm training it physically. And there's such a powerful boost to also doing motor imagery and feeling yourself execute that skill, seeing yourself execute it. It's a super powerful adjunct, not just to youth athletes. Of course, they're the ones who are learning, but elite athletes are learning sometimes too, right? Developing new skills, trying to tweak a technique. So yeah, huge benefits for visualization on learning. And yeah, seemingly all levels of athletes.
Yeah. I mean, I know it happens to be very useful at the top. I remember I went to my first national championship and I was actually quite old in college. Like I was a super senior in college. I was in my 5th year at Oregon,
Right.
which is, for an Olympian, I think it's older to go to your first nationals. So I felt sort of vulnerable because I was like, oh, I'm like, haven't ever been here, but I'm, supposed to do quite well now.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have the excuse of being young, really. And yet I was sort of a freshman. And I remember my teammate, Jordan, who's this amazing athlete, and she was like, just watch everyone freaking out. And it was like so funny because she's such a sweet girl, but she was like, 20% of these people aren't even here anymore. 20% of them are going to run the race in the warm up. 20% of them are already out. And it was like this whole thing of, I think, just mentally, a lot of people take themselves out before the start.
Yeah.
And they maybe do some sort of bad visuals. I don't know what they're doing. They're running the race already or something.
Yeah.
And it's true. There was a large percentage of the race that just felt totally out of touch as we won the national championship. It was very fun.
Yeah. Wow.
It was really fun. And what's interesting is in cross country, now that I think of it, you actually have to imagine your teammates because you're usually not next to them.
Yeah.
Like you're scattered. There's hundreds of people in this race and you're meant to be where you're meant to be, but you need to know how much you're not alone.
Yeah.
So there's even that sense of like imagining it during that you have a pack of girls, even though someone's way up there, someone's back there, you all really matter.
Yeah.
That was quite cool.
Yeah, that's cool. I think there's ways to visualize, like you said, even while you are performing in your sport,
For sure.
right? You don't need to necessarily be lying down, eyes closed to visualize. It can be sometimes a more active process. And that's a pretty good example of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really fun too. I think people forget. I mean, I don't know if they forget, but sports are supposed to be super fun. And the more you're like able to kind of create a sense of wonder or watching yourself do something. And I think the visualization is like a teammate in that.
Yeah.
Because you have this anticipatory feeling of like it can go this way. And then when it starts going that way, it's like, oh, it's going the way.
It's an incredibly exciting feeling to be like, I visualized all these possible outcomes, but like, here's the outcome I'm really going for. Here's the way I want to execute this skill. And like, wow, it's happening. And I think about like a race, especially, the longer distance races you've done, like, I'm sure you visualized what it's going to feel like. Like you are so familiar with that pain experience and what it's going to feel like in your legs and, what that lactate buildup is going to feel like. But like, when you're visualizing, it's helpful to feel that because you're preparing yourself. But then you go a step further of like, okay, how do I want to respond when it gets really freaking hard? When my legs feel like bricks, when my lungs are on fire, like, what do I want to think about? What's, even one kind of keyword or mantra I can use that can get me through, and you practice that and you practice that. So when this moment comes, you're like, yeah, of course this moment's here. I knew it was going to come. I've rehearsed this so many times and like, wow, look at me kind of coping and responding exactly the way that I practiced. It can be an incredibly empowering feeling.
Yeah. It's like creating inevitability.
Yeah.
I love that. So, okay. Can we talk a little bit about the difference between visualization and meditation?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It's, it's a good question. It's a good distinction to make because these are probably, the two most widely discussed kind of mental tools or practices in sport and in sports psychology. They're quite different. And there can sometimes be some misconceptions that visualization is sort of a meditative process. So, I can speak to that. Like meditation, first of all, there are a number of ways to meditate, multiple different traditions of meditation. The type of meditation that is most often used and studied in sport would be mindfulness meditation. So, mindfulness all about paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And meditation is one way to foster that kind of mindset. And for sure, like mindfulness meditation is super powerful. It can be sometimes difficult for people to get into, right? People have difficulty kind of sort of shutting down and focusing on one thing that's very simple. I think for a lot of athletes I work with, that can be hard, right? It's like mindfulness meditation shouldn't be a goal-oriented thing. We shouldn't be, okay, I'm gonna meditate and I'm going to clear my thoughts and I'm going to get super relaxed. As soon as we start to impose those goals, it's actually totally against the philosophy of mindfulness, like the Buddhist tradition. We should just allow whatever the present moment experience is to be what it is. And the experience of meditation, right? Even if the goal isn't to relax, that's often a byproduct. We often feel more relaxed. We often find that maybe our thoughts go from kind of swirling around really fast to slower, and maybe we can just like really be in touch with our breath. It's a great thing. It's also a very different experience than what it's like to visualize, because when we're visualizing, it's a much more active process. If you were to look at images of someone's brain in fMRI when they're doing mindfulness meditation versus when they're visualizing, say, a part of a race, it's going to look very different. It's going to be different types of activation. Again, like those motor regions of our brain are going to be lit up more with visualization. So those are some main differences. Again, visualization is more kind of goal oriented. I want to practice a certain skill in my sport, and here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to get reps in. It's a lot more like physical practice, but I wouldn't say that one is better than the other, right? Because they're achieving different things. When we're visualizing, the benefits in our sport tend to be the things we've talked about: greater confidence, greater sense of familiarity, greater actual motor skill execution. When we're doing mindfulness practice or meditation, there are also benefits. And a lot of times those benefits from the research seem to be reduced stress. That's kind of the first mindfulness interventions that became popular in the West and in medicine were mindfulness-based stress reduction. Other benefits tend to be just like self-regulation. When we're more mindful, we're more aware of what our mind is doing. And so we can direct our mind and our attention in the right places. So two very powerful skills, but they're going to feel quite different when you're doing them. And they're going to have slightly different benefits for your performance.
Yeah, it kind of feels like my visualization always feels kind of like evolution or something inside me. And it's almost like it's beyond where I am on paper, right? And then the meditation almost feels like being able to reach into myself really easily, or neutrality on whatever's going on, which they both feel important, but it feels like different to me.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly how I would sum it up. Both are important and they're different. I do find that some athletes might take to visualization more than, say, a meditation, because again, maybe that the kinds of athletes I'm working with are like, it needs to be goal directed, it needs to be active, but yeah, I would say that there's a place for both, for sure.
Okay. Tell me about, I've heard that Steph Curry, Simone Biles, Phelps, they all visualize. Tell me about, these athletes or any of the athletes we look up to that are already using visualization in their regular routine.
Yeah, there's a lot. The Michael Phelps example, I don't have any personal insights into that, but I've seen so much come out from him and his coach. He's clearly a guy who did visualization, routinely and religiously throughout his career. He talks about, and his coach talks maybe even more about how that worked for him, where he would lie down and visualize a race, and his coach would use a stopwatch, and he would visualize the race literally to the second that he wanted to actually execute the race at. And his coach was pretty astonished to find that when I stopped the stopwatch, that was like the time that he would end up swimming, which is pretty wild and reflective of, how skilled he was at this. So it clearly worked out pretty well for him. And yeah, really a lot of athletes are talking about this now. It's, I think rightfully so, part of the conversation on the mental side of sport, because it's super valuable. And like I said, it's a way to get an extra edge. There's only so much physical training you can do.
Yeah. I even imagine it would be a useful thing during the off season to visualize detraining a little, or like visualize something that is like allowing you to come back the next season.
Yeah.
Because there's so much fatigue associated with these big seasons or these Olympic cycles. And I don't know, I just like thinking like, because I have a race coming up in October, and I sometimes I think I'm like I want to think about the race, but I also want to know that there's like something after that is like, the equivalent of a performance, but in recovery.
Yeah. I think there's value to that. In that sense, it sounds like it's kind of motivating to be like, at the end of this journey, there's something else that I can look forward to. And that can, imagining that can maybe help you like hang on and know that that's coming, and like in a way maybe also make you more present on what's happening now, because I know that's coming. I can look forward to that, and I can shift back to the moment.
Or, in ultra running, because this is newer for me, I was Olympic 10K runner. Ultra running, and maybe this is too like inside baseball, but
now let's hear it.
It's fun. So you have these aid stations. And I remember when I ran my first 100-miler, I was really like maybe physically unprepared to run this race, but I was like mentally good. I was physically strong. I just wasn't trained very hard. But my friends were there, and part of my visualization was during the race, there are these, aid stations every couple hours. And I would just imagine my friends there. And it was so motivating to be able to get to them, which I guess is not maybe the side of this that is about the motor skills. This might be more the like, I can get through this 26-mile chunk just to get my best friend to pour soda down my throat and ask me how I'm doing. Like I think there's probably some like almost like sense of humor you can bring into this, or sense of like community visualizing, not just the physical relationship with yourself.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to a super important point. I've certainly never run an ultra race, but I follow some Instagram accounts. So I have a little bit of an insight into the community. So I can see the value of that. And I think you're speaking to all the different use cases and the different functions of visualization, because, I've talked a fair bit about like motor imagery, visualizing sport movements, and that, has the most research. But in my actual practice with athletes, there's all kinds of reasons why they're using visualization. So you mentioned that one. That is like, that has an emotional boost, that has a motivating effect, maybe even a bit of a humor effect, like you said. That's one use case. There's others where, we talk about like an environmental familiarization visualization, where it's like, I'm going to be in the Olympic Village, and that is going to be chaos, and I've never been there before. Like, what is, I want to get a little bit more comfortable in that environment. So what can you do? You can look up pictures of, okay, they've built the village. Here's what it's going to look like. I can imagine what it's going to be like with all these athletes from all these different nations. And I can imagine like, I'm going to walk from my dorm or my building to like get some chocolate muffins, and like, what is that going to be like? And when you get there, it might sound like trivial or simple, but like, you're going to feel a little bit more comfortable. That's one interesting use case. Healing focused visualization. Like, I want to visualize being able to completely trust this injured body part and having it be really strong again. Of course, a component of that could be movement oriented. Like, I'm going to practice moving and doing these specific exercises. Coping focused visualization. Like, outside the realm of sport, there's so much research on what's called imaginal exposure, which is, let's say someone has difficulties with panic or, anxiety, or someone has PTSD. You can use the imagination to imagine a stressful, anxiety-provoking experience, not just in a sadistic way, like to feel that emotion and eventually habituate to that emotion over time, with repeated repetitions, and to feel that emotion and to practice coping with that emotion, right? Like, being at the starting line, there's going to be a ton of physiological arousal. If the only time you feel that and practice that is when you're at the starting line, you're missing out potentially. You can practice coping with that many times in your mind. So many different use cases.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that visualization is a practice that you're meant to do frequently and before you need it, because it's meant to be there. I mean, I'm sure there's skills we all want to improve, but there's also scenarios that are patterns for us that we can, in our calmest state, in our free time or in time we carve out, we can prepare.
Yeah, exactly. It should be ongoing and not just when we're in a crisis mode, right? Like that's never good. Oh shoot, I'm feeling really weak. I need to start lifting weights. No one would say that's an advisable strategy, right? It's an ongoing practice. And the same applies to visualization and other forms of mental training.
So earlier you said 3 times a week was when some of those studies were picking up patterns from athletes. How often, let's get practical.
Yeah. Let's get practical.
How often should people do it? When should they do it?
Yeah. Yep.
And, what are people doing right and wrong with their visualization practice?
Yeah, for sure. The practical is important. So 3 times a week is a pretty good benchmark. It's valuable to visualize like the same goal multiple times. People might have a lot of different things they want to visualize, and that's okay. But in a lot of the studies, they're visualizing one very specific thing multiple times over time. So you want to be fairly focused. So yeah, it could be 10 minutes per session. There's nothing magical about 10 minutes, but that's kind of the average. One good thing to note is, while your body is not getting fatigued from visualization, your mind can. So some people who are really hardcore, like, well, I'm going to visualize like my marathon. It's like, whoa, that's a lot to do.
Yeah.
That is not advised because there's a cognitive fatigue effect to visualization, which, it means your mind is working, but it also means like, don't spend an hour straight visualizing and then attempt to go train in your sport, because there's going to be a spillover effect, right? Where you're then physically fatigued trying to perform. So the timing matters. You don't want to go overboard. That's one way that I think people can veer off course. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I was trying to think like how people typically incorporate this. Like, with the athletes you work with, is it a morning thing? Is it whenever's best for them? Or what do you do with your athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can be hard for athletes to fit this in, right? Like there's already so many things going on in a day when you account for training, recovery, et cetera. What I'll often recommend is visualizing after they've trained. Sometime, it doesn't need to be right after, but sometime after they've trained, because through physical training, they're able to use that memory to prime their visualization. It tends to be easier to visualize something from memory than creating something out of thin air, which you can do. But so I'll often say that visualize after training. The time of day, there's nothing magical about, any particular time of day. You probably want to be in a space where you have some mental energy. Sometimes people will visualize like in bed at night, because that's just when they finally have the time to do it. And that works for some athletes. Although again, speaking of the effects of visualization, right? It's not a peaceful meditation for most people. It's very physiologically arousing and activating. So, that's not a time I would want to visualize personally, right? When I'm trying to wind down. So I'll typically tell people like at least an hour or 2 before bed, if you can. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I guess, are there any other tips you have for getting the most out of Are there any other tips you have for getting the most out of visualizing?
Yeah. Let's see. There's a lot of best practices out there. It's probably things like using as many senses as you can, focusing on the same particular goal and really hitting that hard, the same goal multiple times.
And wait, is the goal like a physical goal usually? Like it's like a skill, it's getting over a hill. Like, is that usually what the goal is?
Yeah, exactly. Kind of the specific focus area, the specific thing you're trying to achieve, the specific technique you're trying to work on, the thing you're trying to overcome. Repetitions matter, just like they matter with physical training. So more reps tend to be better. Other things you can do to get the most out of it would be, you don't need to be, again, lying down with eyes closed to do visualization right. There's some research showing that you might actually want to adopt the posture, roughly speaking, that you're in when you're performing a skill. For example, if I am a power lifter or something, which I'm clearly not, but if I was trying to work on squatting, I might want to do my visualizing with my eyes closed, but also like in a more upright posture, as if I'm actually, doing a back squat. So that matters. There's even some research on dynamic motor imagery, which is basically visualizing, but mimicking some of the movements you would make with your actual sport. So it could be like subtle hand movements or swings, right? If you're running, it could be like holding a golf club, things like that. That seems to be a way to get even more out of visualization. The perspective is another thing that matters. So first person perspective, am I seeing things through my own eyes as I visualize, or am I watching myself as if removed from my body? And the research seems to suggest that first person is likely the best. It tends to light up our brain more when we're visualizing first person. So that's typically what I suggest, and eyes closed. And with a script, if you can, something that's structured and repeatable. But regarding the perspective, there are some situations where you could visualize third person watching yourself. For example, if there's a team sport athlete, a quarterback or a basketball player who is trying to mentally rehearse plays, let's say, it's valuable to see yourself execute the play, but also like observe the movement of everyone around you and see how you fit in as a part to the whole. So perspective is one piece.
That's really interesting. I've never done it. I think I've never done it. Maybe like in track, like where you kind of want to see, I don't know, you imagine the big stadium and people watching. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's really cool. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode of Visualization 101 with Cairo.